All right, Revelation chapter 9. Now we're going to start tonight the second woe, which is the sixth seal. Chapter 9 verse 12 says, "One woe is past, and behold, there come two woes more hereafter." And the first woe, of course, is the fifth seal, the fifth trumpet, rather. And the second woe is the sixth trumpet. Verse 13, "And the sixth angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the altar, of the golden altar, which is before God, saying to the sixth angel which had the trumpet, Loose the four angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates." Now that golden altar, in verse 13, the sixth angel sounded, and he hears this voice from the four horns of the golden altar, which is before God. Now the voice turns out to be the voice of God. As we get on down to the passage, it'll be very clear that that's what it is. This is the voice of God, as in Psalm chapter 2, when He shall speak to them in His wrath and vex them in His sore displeasure. This is God speaking in His wrath. But you notice where He speaks from. He speaks from, the verse says, from the four horns of the golden altar. Now, you understand where we are. We've studied this back in the first part of chapter number 8. The golden altar is in the temple, not on the earth, but in heaven. And that heavenly temple had the altar there, the altar of incense, and the golden altar outside and so forth. And this position, the horns were the power of it. And what's happening here is the prayers, if you look back in chapter 6, verse number 9, with the fifth seal. When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of them that were slain for the word of God and for the testimony they held. And they cried with a loud voice, How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth? And in that fifth seal, and I told you when we studied through that it wasn't clear at that point in Revelation exactly where that altar was or what that altar was, but it was sure clear that the souls under that altar were crying out to God to send vengeance on those who had persecuted them. Now that fifth seal is in the first part of the tribulation. In chapter number 8, when we start opening the seventh seal, he says in chapter 8, verse 1, And when he opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven about the space of half an hour. And I tried to show you from Old Testament references that silence was a silence that demonstrated it was that pause between when prayers were offered up in the temple and when the answer to the prayers were given. It's sort of, okay, there are my requests. It's your turn to answer. And that's what this silence is here. Verse 2, And I saw the seven angels which stood before God, and to them were given seven trumpets. And another angel stood at the altar, having the golden censer. This is the altar in heaven, up in the third heaven. The one that Moses built and Solomon had were just the models that were built on the pattern of the true temple. And there was given unto him much incense, that he should offer with it with the prayers of all saints upon the golden altar which is before the throne. And the smoke of the incense which came with the prayers of the saints ascended up before God out of the angel's hand. And the angel took the censer and filled it with fire of the altar and cast it into the earth. There were voices and thunderings and lightnings and an earthquake. And the seven angels that had the seven trumpets prepared themselves to sound. And then you begin to go through the sounding of the angels. Now it's real clear. These souls are praying for God to avenge them, for Him to pour out His vengeance on His enemies. Their prayers now in chapter 8 are ready to be answered. They're praying. And they pray and they say, How long, how long, how long? Now in chapter 8, it's time to have the prayers answered. And the trumpet judgments that blow, the first one's in verse 7 there. The seven angels take the seven trumpets, and the blowing of the seven trumpets is the answer of the prayers that these saints were praying for God to pour out His judgment and His vengeance on the world. And so the seven trumpets are literally the answer to the prayer for vengeance to be poured out. The vengeance of God is poured out in these trumpets. and the answers to the prayer, and the horns of the altar, the place where the blood was put. You go back there and you'll see that that altar had horns around it where the priest put, blood was constantly put on those horns, and inside of the perimeters of the horns of that altar was fire burning. And that thing represented the fact that sin had to be judged. Either it's going to be judged by fire, it's going to be paid for by blood, but it's going to be avenged and it's going to be dealt with. And the prayers of the saints are going up there requesting the vengeance to be poured out, and the time for that vengeance has come. And so God begins to pour out His vengeance in these trumpets. The first four, we've studied them, were poured out on the earth. And God pours out wrath on the environment in which men live, on the sea and on the land, and so on and so forth. Then He pours out the last three of those trumpets are called woes. And the reason the first four are just there and then the last three are separated apart, and those last three are woes, is because the vengeance in them, those trumpets are going to be poured out upon the people of the earth. Not just the planet, but on mankind itself. And so we go through the first woe. And that first woe we studied last time in some detail. In that first woe, men in the earth get a taste of hell on earth. If you've ever wondered what it would be like to have hell belched out on the earth and men suffering the torment of hell and not being able to die, just like men in hell can't die, that's what happens. Those scorpion-like locusts, those locusts that come out and sting, that demonic horde that comes out of the bottomless pit when God sends the angel down and opens the bottomless pit, and all these demonic creatures that we studied about last time come out into the earth. They go out and inflict the torment of hell upon mankind, and men pray to die and can't, just like in hell. So they have the taste of hell under the first woe, and it's terrible. But that's only the first one. There's still two more to go. And so the second one starts in verse 13. And the sixth angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar, which is before God, saying to the sixth angel, which had the trumpet, see, God speaks to the angel and tells him to loose. He's speaking in His wrath, and He's going to vex them. And He tells the angel to go and loose the four angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. And the four angels were loosed, which were prepared for an hour and a day and a month and a year, for to slay the third part of man. And the number of the army of the horsemen were 200,000 thousands. That's 200 million. 1,000,000 is a million. You got 200 million man army. And I heard the number of them. And then he goes on and talks about what they look like. Now that issue there of that sixth angel sounding, he reminds you there in verse 13 that of the golden altar. He's reminding you, don't forget, these things are being poured out. This is the answer of the prayer back there in chapter 6. This is the result of the prayers of the saints calling out for vengeance. And so here they come. Now you'll notice that thing in verse 14, and it's fascinating. You study, and I've studied the Scripture for years, and I'll study through a passage, and then the last thing I do after I've just got everything done and everything figured out, I usually will go get any commentaries that I have about a passage, and I'll go and sit and read through them. And I do that for two reasons. One, just in case you miss something that you ought to adjust yourself by. Maybe there's something you didn't get. And two, I guess I do it sometimes just for a chuckle. And this passage is a real good one because, boy, they read through this passage and it's just blank. Not a whole lot there. And I think, man, I don't know. I had a whole 2 pages worth of notes that I had, and then I get to wondering, well, why did I get so many notes and commentaries didn't have anything? But I don't know why that is, but I know one thing. It's fascinating to read. This guy looses 4 angels. And look where they are. They're bound. They're in chains. Like in 2 Peter 2, the angels that are reserved in chains of darkness, and they're held reserved under judgment. They're bound in the great river Euphrates. Now here's another demonic host. We just saw these demons come up out of the bottomless pit and be belched out into the earth there for 5 months. Now we've got another host of demons. These are 4 angels, obviously fallen angels because they're bound, and they're bound in the river Euphrates of all places. And then they're released to inflict the second woe on the earth, and we'll see what that is in a minute. But notice that where they're bound in the river Euphrates. Now, there's a reason that they're bound in the river Euphrates. Come back with me to Genesis chapter number 2. We've studied in the past the issue about Eden and about that territory over there that's bounded on one side by Euphrates. And the reason that they're bound in the river Euphrates is that the river Euphrates is a boundary line. It's one of the boundary lines for a very special territory in the Bible that God claims as His own. It's the eastern boundary line of the land God promised to Abraham. It's the eastern boundary line of the country that God called Eden. And if you'll take, and you'll have to go back, we're not going to do it in this study, but if you go back into Genesis studies and get the tapes, and you go back there when we went through Genesis on Wednesday night, or was it whenever it was, not the Sunday morning, but the study through Genesis, I went back and I went through and I showed you how you can identify where Eden is. And Eden is that territory that's bounded on the east by the Euphrates River. And it's bounded on the west by the Mediterranean. And it goes up to an apex just like the so-called Fertile Crescent that you study about in geography. And its the bottom points of that triangle, one is the Nile River and one is the Euphrates River over here as it goes into the Persian Gulf. And that area, Saudi Arabia and Iran and all that territory over there, all of that area, Palestine and Lebanon and Syria and all that territory is a piece of ground. In the Bible, it's called the country of Eden. And in Genesis 2, verse number 8, the Lord God planted a garden in Eden. Everybody just sat there. When I don't read a verse right on purpose, what are you supposed to say? No, preacher. I mean, I go all over the country telling people to do that, and here at home you don't do that. And I know, sometimes I read it because I don't see it straight when I'm reading it and that kind of stuff. But I'm talking about when I obviously did it on purpose to make a point. God planted a garden eastward in Eden. See, Eden is the country. Eden is the territory. And He puts the garden eastward in Eden. And out of the ground, verse number 10, and a river went out of Eden to water the garden. And from thence it parted and became into 4 heads. The name of the first is Pison, that it is which compasseth the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. And the gold of that land is good, but the bdellium and the onyx stone, there is the bdellium and onyx stone. Now I don't know where Pison is. I've never been able to figure out where that thing's located. I don't know anybody that does know. If you wanted to find some gold, though, I'd say go try to find out the land of Havilah and go find the gold, because there's good gold there, and there's some of that pitch and stuff there, and the precious stones, but I don't know where it is. This is the geography of Eden prior to the flood. When the flood came, it wiped all this stuff out and changed the topography. But there's this river. Then verse 13, and the name of the second river is Gihon. The same is it that compasseth the whole land of Ethiopia. And the name of the third river is Hiddekel. That is it which goeth toward the east of Assyria. Now Hiddekel is usually identified as the Tigris, because the Hebrew word there is the Tigris. And you'll see it again over in Daniel chapter 10, verse 4, where Daniel is sitting out on the banks of the Hiddekel. So it's obviously a reference to something of that nature. But what I wanted you to see was the last one there, the fourth one. And the fourth river is Euphrates. You see, out on that eastern boundary, even of Eden, there was the river Euphrates. So when you come over to chapter 15, Genesis 15, it's not surprising that when God gives Abraham the dimensions of the land that he's going to give to him in verse 18, and in the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, Unto thy seed have I given this land, from the river of Egypt. Now what's the great river of Egypt? The Nile River. Unto the great river, the river Euphrates. You see, God gave Abraham the land from the Nile River all the way over to the river Euphrates, and then up around like that. The bottom apex of the triangle is the Nile on one side and the Euphrates on the other. The Euphrates River is a border, it's the eastern border of the country and the land that God has especially given to Abraham. Now come with me over to Deuteronomy chapter number 11. Deuteronomy chapter 11. And this stuff, you'll see this stuff repeated over and over in the Scripture. Deuteronomy chapter 11. God gave that land to them for an everlasting possession. Deuteronomy 11 verse 21. That your days may be multiplied in the days of your children, and the land which the Lord sware unto your fathers to give them as the days of heaven upon earth. What kind of days do they have in heaven? They have everlasting days, eternal days. You see, he says, I'm going to give you that land, and I'm going to give it to you by the measure of the days of heaven. The measure by which Israel is going to possess that land is eternal days, the days of heaven. For if ye shall diligently keep all these commandments, which I commanded you to do them, to love the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, and to cleave unto him, then will the Lord drive out all these nations from before you, and you shall possess greater nations and mightier than yourselves. Every place whereon the soles of your foot shall tread shall be yours. From the wilderness and Lebanon, from the river Euphrates, even unto the uttermost sea, shall your coast be. Now the uttermost sea would obviously be the Mediterranean Sea. If you're standing over the Euphrates, you're looking over to the uttermost, the farthest sea over there, that's the Mediterranean Sea. So you've got the boundary. On one side is the Euphrates, and on the other side is the Mediterranean, and it's going to run down all the way to the Nile on one side, and it'll have to go down to the Persian Gulf on the other. And if you take those two things and you run up there, you're going to come to a place up here, and the apex will be up around Mount Ararat, where the ark landed with Moses, and that's the country of Eden. The point is that the Euphrates is that boundary over there. Euphrates, where these four angels are confined. Come with me to back to Revelation chapter number 16. The place where these four angels are confined is in that river, which is the eastern boundary of the nation Israel's land, the land that God has given to them. And it's a boundary that is associated with the judgment of God at the second advent. What great city do you remember that was located on the river Euphrates? He almost said it and didn't know it. The city of Babylon. Babylon is located on the eastern banks of the Euphrates. In fact, it even had part of the river running under its walls and so forth, although the city itself was on the eastern side there. The city of Babylon is associated with these four angels. With the river Euphrates. Revelation chapter 16. Now this is not the same situation as in chapter 9, but it is another situation with the river Euphrates. Revelation 16:12, and the sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. And I saw three unclean spirits like frogs come out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, for they are the spirits of devils working miracles, which go forth unto the kings of the earth and of the whole world, to gather them to the battle of the great day of God Almighty. The angel comes there and he smites the river Euphrates. He pours his vial out on it, and the river dries up. Again, the judgment on the Euphrates. The Euphrates plays a great part in the judgment associated with the tribulation. Folks, and the reason for that is, as we're going to see as we get on over in Revelation, is that the Antichrist has a headquarters over there. And it's out at the outskirts of the territory that God's going to give Israel. It's out at the border. And you'll see in 2 Samuel chapter 8, David goes out and he's going to fight a battle. And he goes out to the border over there of the Euphrates and fights the enemy and wins the battle against the enemy there. In other words, where would you want to fight the battle? Go out to the edge of your territory and do it. Well, it's the same place and so forth. Come back with me to Jeremiah chapter 51. Jeremiah chapter 51, 50 and 51 here, is a passage of Scripture that talks about the destruction at the second advent of Babylon. And the whole passage is running through here. You're involved in the doom of Babylon, that you see the fall of Babylon in Revelation 14, Revelation 17 and 18. We'll get over there, we'll study it. We'll come back here and study in some detail, and you'll see how that Jeremiah 50 and 51 fit right into the judgment that Revelation chapter 17 and 18 talk about falling on Babylon. In Jeremiah chapter 51, verse number 62, then shalt thou say, O Lord, thou shalt speak against this place to cut it down. And he's talking about cutting down and destroying Babylon. Thus shalt thou speak against this place to cut it down, that none shall remain in it, neither man nor beast, but that it shall be desolate forever. And it shall be, when thou hast made an end of the reading of this book. Now here's what Jeremiah is to do when he finishes reading. That thou shalt bind to a stone to it, and cast it into the Euphrates. And thou shalt say, thus shall Babylon sink, and shall not rise, for the evil that I will bring upon her, and they shall be weary. Thus far are the words of Jeremiah. Now that's just like Revelation 18, verse 21, when you see Babylon sinking. I've read that verse and I've thought, I wonder why God would tell Jeremiah to tie that book up on a stone and throw it in the river over there. Why would he say throw it in the river Euphrates? You think maybe he might have thrown it in where the angels were, so when it went down they could read it? Well, I don't know, but that's an idea. My point is that when God judges Babylon, the river Euphrates is there, and the issue is that when we're talking about the Euphrates over there and where those angels are, come with me to Isaiah 13, where those angels are bound, they're bound there at Babylon. Now that brings up the thing that we talked to you last time about, when I tried to talk to you about the way the underworld was, and the way the things there in the heart of the earth are. You've got Mediterranean, Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea, Jerusalem's here. Babylon is located over here with the Euphrates like that down to the Persian Gulf, and that isn't anywhere close to anything that's real, okay? Everybody understands that? I'm not making out like that's a geographically even resembling map. I just got to have something up here to squiggle with. Here's Babylon over here. All right, here's Jerusalem over here. The Nile River here, Eden's in here like this, this area. These angels they're in the river Euphrates, and they're going to be loosed out of that river. They are associated with the fall of Babylon, with Babylon. And they're associated with Babylon is some angels bound. They are prisoners right now, but they're going to be loosed. Last time we saw in Revelation 9 that over here, south of the Dead Sea, there is a place on the earth down here south of the Dead Sea where the angel opens up the bottomless pit, and these angels come out of there, like in Isaiah chapter 34. And there is an opening and a shaft that goes down into the prison of the bottomless pit, and it's on the earth, and it's located here. And during the millennial kingdom, people are going to be able to come out here and look into that thing before they go home. And somebody asked me after the service last week, well, what about something about Babylon? And I said to him, I said, well, you go home and read Isaiah chapter 13. Because in Isaiah 13, beginning in verse number 19, you'll see almost identically the same passage that we read last Sunday night in Isaiah chapter 34 about this territory right here. The indication is that over here, as well as over here, there is an opening and some kind of a prison for spirits, spirit worlds, angelic hosts. Now whether these angels are just there in the river with the water on them, or whether they're in the earth underneath that, and that's the door at which they're able to get out, I don't know. It's not clear. I do know about the bottomless pit over here and stuff. We studied that. But this thing over here is that there's also a place over there where they're going to be let out. And it's like in the millennium, either this whole territory in there or this one here for sure and this one over here are opened up. And people are able literally to look down into and see the damned in hell through that. Now I don't get clearly whether it's the whole area, but I do know Isaiah 34 it's here, Isaiah 13 it's there, and so forth. And we talked to you last time, tried to identify for you those degenerated things and how they came out of there. Now go back with me to Revelation chapter number 9. So you've got the Euphrates involved here, and the reason the Euphrates is involved there is because of the judgment that's going to be upon Babylon, and those angels are there. And I've tried to say to you in the past, and we'll study more detail as we get on into the issue of Babylon, that the place of the first rebellion back there in Genesis 11 with Nimrod, that place of that rebellion is going to be the ultimate place of the concluding rebellion with the Antichrist. And we'll see that as we go. So 9:14, he looses the four angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. So it's a reason that issue is there. Now notice the duration of this woe. And the four angels were loosed, which were prepared for an hour and a day and a month and a year, for to slay a third part of man. Now we're going to talk more about next time about the third part of man and the slaying and what they are. But notice the time element here. These guys are laid out here. And the duration in verse 15 of that second woe is for 1 hour, a day, a month, and a year. See how exact that is? That's 1 year, 1 month, 1 day, and 1 hour. Well, a year is 360 days in prophecy. A month is 30 days, and then 1 day, and then 1 hour. So you got 391 days plus 1 hour. That's how long that thing is going to last. Now, if it lasts 391 days, that's, if you just round it off to 390, that's 13 months. Now, the one that was back in chapter 9, verse 5, the first woe, it was 5 months. Now 13 months and 5 months is 18 months. 18 months is 1 year and a half, 1.5 years. Does that ring a bell for you? Do you remember how if the seals and the first 4 trumpets lasted for 2 years, what would you have? You'd have 3.5 years up to this point right here. You know where that sixth trumpet, that second woe, this stuff is all taking place midweek. Where you are when you get to chapter 9, you're in the middle of the 70th week. That's why these things are called woes. But they're woes because you're coming right up to the hump of the 70th week. You're right in the middle of that 7-year period, and you're coming right up to the middle where the day of His wrath and the great tribulation like never been before is fixing to come. And that thing commences and is pictured over in chapter 15 and 16 under the vials of the wrath of God being poured out. So what you're doing is you're leading up to that. And so he says, woe, woe, woe. Now you'll notice that chapter 10 and chapter 11 contain a lot of information that don't have anything to do specifically with the sixth seal. The sixth trumpet. Look over in chapter 11, verse number 14. The second woe is past, and behold, the third woe cometh quickly. And the seventh angel sounded, And there were great voices in heaven saying, and so the kingdoms of this world will become the kingdoms of our Lord and His Christ. Well, the second woe isn't ended until chapter 11, verse 14. That means that chapter 10 and the first 14 verses of chapter 11 are still, you're still back there before the seventh trumpet sounds. What you've got, you remember when we studied Revelation, the seals, and you got through the first 6 of them, and then Revelation 7 was sort of like a parenthesis. You remember that? And then you have the 7th seal after that. And I tried to show you that what that parenthesis did is he went along and he marked the seals out for you. 1, 2, 4, 5, 6. And then he put a parenthesis that kind of went back in here and showed you some of the things going to go on while those seals were taking place. Then he does the 7th seal. And the 7th seal opens up 7 trumpets. And what happens is you get over here, and after that 6th trumpet, there's a parenthesis before the 7th one. And that parenthesis kind of shows you things that are details of what's going to go on during that time there. In other words, if you got the sequence going on, we've got to keep the sequence boom, 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 boom going. But did you ever wonder what was taking place somewhere else, what else was happening while those things were being poured out? So he stops and goes back and says, now let me tell you about what's happening to the people upon which all this stuff is falling. And that's what these parentheses are for. And the parenthesis is in chapter 10 and 11, and then chapter 12 through 14 are all parentheses that describes events that are going on while these things over here, especially these woes, are taking place. And those chapters right there, folks, are all midweek. All of them. Come with me to chapter 11. I'm trying to get you to see where you are in the time sequence of the tribulation period in the 70th week. Chapter 11. Chapter number 11, verse 2. And the court which is without the temple leave out, measure it not, for it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall be trodden under foot 42 months. Well, I don't care if you say 42 months this way or that way, 42 months, that's 3.5 years of 30-day months, which is a prophetic month. That's in the middle of the week, either way you slice it. Verse number 3, and I will give power unto my 2 witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,260 days. That's 1,260 days is 42 months of 30-day months, which is 3.5 years. You're in the middle of the week when you're reading chapter number 11. But that isn't all. Come down to chapter number 12. Verse number 6. The woman fled into the wilderness where she was had a place prepared of God that they should feed her 1,260 days. Still in the middle of the week in chapter 12. Come down to verse 14. And to the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place where she is nourished for a time, that's 1, and times, that's plural, that'd be 2, so that'd be 1 is a time, times would be 2 more, it'd be 2, 3, and a half time, there's the half, from the face of the serpent. Well, that's identified in verse 6 as 1,260 days, 3.5 years. A time, times, and a half a time is defined in Revelation 12, verse 14 and verse 6 as being 1,260 days, which means 3.5 years. So I know what a time, times, and a half a time, that's 3.5 years. Time, 1, times, that'd be 2 and 3, and a half time would be 3.5. So I know what I got there, but I also know where I'm at. The things that are going on in chapter 12 take place in the middle of the week. We're not over at the end yet. You realize that when you're in chapter 12 and 13 of the book of Revelation, you still aren't halfway through the thing? Man, you talk, and it's been bad up till now. And Jesus says that this stuff that's going on now isn't anything compared to the rest of it, because the rest of it is going to be worse than anything ever known. I mean, how are you going to get much worse than hell on earth? How are you going to get much worse than what a 200 million man army coming in and stomping all over Israel? We're going to study the war that comes up there in some detail next couple of weeks. It's amazing. Tremendous war going on right in the middle of the week. 200 million man army invades Israel. Kills a third of the population. And you look at that and you think, whoo, and that's not the worst. That's just the second woe. There's another one coming, and there's 7 vials of his wrath. You say, man, it's getting bad. We're in the middle of the week. It's important to follow the sequential order through the book. Chapter 13, verse 5. Now, chapter 13, where is that? There was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue. What? The Antichrist is still going to minister for 42 more months. 3.5 years, last half of the week. Chapter 12, chapter 13, chapter 11, all of this information is what's going on during the middle part of the week. And what he's doing here is he's going to give you details. Scofield, if you've got a Scofield Reference Bible, if I remember right, he calls it, this passage in chapter 12 and 13, the 7 personages of the tribulation. And what he means by that is the 7 different identifiable groups that you have to deal with. And they're all right there in the middle of the week. And when we go through that, you'll see how who they are and where they go. But the middle of that 70th week is sort of like the little culminating point where things materialize. All of human history, all of prophetic history has been moving and marching toward where we are right here. Because this is the time when the Antichrist, the man of sin, is going to go sit in the temple and declare himself to be the son of perdition. Declare himself to be God, rather. Become the son of perdition by doing that. This is the point where he's going to come and he's going to say, I'm Jesus Christ. Worship me. And he's going to have the ability to deceive the whole world. And I don't know if you've ever wondered how that could come about. But my friend, he's going to be able to point out there to them and say, there's been 3.5 years of tribulation woe, like has never been on the earth before. I mean, you've suffered hell on earth, you've suffered the invading armies, and you've been through Armageddon, and I've delivered you. I'm him. You see, that first 3.5 years has to set up the counterfeit so he can show up and identify who he is, identify himself, and claim to be who he is. And it's amazing how, as you go through here, you begin to see all this stuff. It's the river Euphrates. We go over there in chapter 16 at the Battle of Armageddon, and there's the river Euphrates again. And it's amazing. You take a chart and you chart out the 7, the seals and the trumpets, and then you go over here with the 7, those last vials, and they look alike. Look like this over here is a repeat of this. And I got to thinking, why would that be that way? Then it dawned on me, this guy over here has got to be able to point to counterfeit. He's got to point to the judgments and say, see, that proves I'm Jesus Christ. And so that there's a similarity there that he'll use to deceive the nations with. And we're going to study on down next time as we go down through verse 16 and follow. Let me read it to you. The number of the army, 9:16. Were 200,000 thousands, 200 million, and I heard the number of them. And thus I saw the horses in the vision, and they that sat on them had breastplates of fire, and of jacinth and brimstone. They must have smelled real good. Brimstone's like rotten eggs, sulfur. And the heads of the horses were as the heads of lions, and out of their mouth issued fire and smoke and brimstone. By these 3 was the 3rd part of men killed by the fire and by the smoke and by the brimstone which issued out of their mouth. For their power is in their mouth and in their tails. For their tails were like unto serpents, and their heads, and with them they do hurt. They had heads. Now you read that and you say, what in the world is that? Well, most people say, and you'd have to agree, that that's a supernatural demonic host. These 4 angels go out, evidently to the 4 corners of the earth. But they gather together a demonic army, a demonically inspired army. I read that thing there, and I think, I've seen people draw pictures of what that thing in verse 17 and 18 and 19 is supposed to look like. And they have all these demonic, you know what, I read that and I think, could that possibly be John as a first century man trying to describe, and you think about this till next time, will you? Trying to describe in his first century vocabulary what 21st century warfare would look like. Think about that, would you? A guy that never saw a light bulb trying to describe a light bulb. Well, he wouldn't call it electric light, would he? What would he call it? Something familiar to a first century man, but that we would still understand, all through the ages would still understand. Someone that never saw an airplane, never saw a tank, never saw a weaponry fire like we just saw on the television firing over there in the Persian Gulf War. I don't know if that's what that is or not. I'm going to show you next time what I think it is and how I think it works out. And I don't question at all that it's a demonically inspired army, but I do question whether or not it's not also a human army, the demons going out and gathering together, this being the supernatural force behind a literal army. And we'll talk about some of that. But think about that, would you? Do some homework and read verse 17, 18, and 19 and try. Now, some of you brothers are artists, you know, you're good with penmanship. Maybe some of you'd like to draw some of that. Sit down sometime, let your imagination just try to draw it. See what, I can't do that. I don't have any ability to draw anything. You know that. You can look at the way I draw charts. But I tell you, if you thought about it, you might come up with something that would be helpful to us. But I wonder, you know, when I read that, I understand the supernatural, the demonic hordes. I understand the stuff we talked about last time about the degeneration and these things coming out in that degenerate form. But I know one thing, when they come out, that army goes across there, it destroys terribly. And it's the second woe in the earth. All right. It's good to be saved from that, isn't it? When he says we're going to be saved from the wrath to come through him, that's the stuff that salvation ought to make us glad we have.